For years, the majority Sunni kingdom of Saudi Arabia has embarked on a conquest of geopolitical influence in Yemen, with a devastating effect on the innocent civilians living in the nation. The root of the conflict lies in the Houthi revolt against the Yemeni government in a bid to force reform, decrease corruption, increase government accountability, and ensure equal economic opportunity. However, the Saudi kingdom saw it as an act of aggression that could harm its interests in the region, intervening in the conflict. Since then, the Sauds have waged a devastating campaign of airstrikes and naval blockades against the Yemeni rebels. The war in Yemen has killed 50,000 people. The UN indicates that 24 million people, close to 80% of the population, are in need of direct aid because the conflict has destroyed clean water infrastructure and limited food and health care. Through this all, the United States has stood firmly behind Saudi Arabia, backing them in all their endeavors, which brings about the question, what can we do to influence the House of Saud's actions in Yemen? And what should we do from there?
What was the turning point which forced you to flee the country?
I think I realized that once the war had escalated to the point that it had following the Saudi airstrikes, there was no real hope for a safe future for myself or my family in the country. And I think I knew that in order to protect ourselves, we'd have to leave the one country we'd ever known and thrust ourselves into the unknown. But it was better than certain death.
Wanting to pursue this conflict in greater detail, I took a flight to Muscat, the capital of Oman. There, I visited a local Yemeni refugee camp, where I interviewed one of the more knowledgeable citizens who fled Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, after the war broke out. Karim al-Shabazz was a local business owner in Yemen, who fled after Saudi Arabian planes bombed his local market. He is willingly here today to share his story.
Karim, it is a pleasure to meet with you today. What do you believe was the root cause of the Yemeni civil war?
The Yemeni government, until after the Arab Spring protest, struggled to deal with the rampant poverty and other problems that we had in the country, especially the president at the time, President Hadi.
Right.
And many people believed he was weak and ineffective as a ruler because of that. So these tensions became even worse due to the fact that a lot of these people who didn't like Hadi still held their allegiances to the former president, Ali Saleh. And so these factors all came to head when rebel forces took control of the northern Sada province of the nation, and then later the capital, Sana'a, which forced Hadi into exile and caused a civil war.
What is your opinion on the pending negotiations brokered by the United Nations to bring peace between the Houthi rebels and the Yemeni central government?
So I have no problem with the actual content of the negotiations themselves, but I think that they've been way too slow, and that the United Nations has not addressed these negotiations with the urgency they needed to, and they have not treated this crisis as an immediate crisis as they should have.
Clearly, Mr. al-Shabazz feels as though the United States aiding the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the Yemen conflict has only inflamed the situation and has only contributed to the loss of life. But I wanted to get the opinion from the horse's mouth. Wanting to find another point of view regarding this struggle, I traveled to Riyadh, where I was fortunate enough to have a conversation with the Crown Prince of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman.
Your Highness, it is an honor to meet you formally. American. Hello.
So, the general vibe that the international community has been painting is that the Saudis are committing atrocities in Yemen. What do you think of this? And do you admit to worsening the conflict in Yemen through military action?
Absolutely not. The Sauds have offered to end the war in Yemen multiple times, but each and every single time, the Houthi rebels refused. And the one time they did accept, they violated the ceasefire treaty 300 times and effectively resumed the war even though we were in a period of peace. Moreover, when looking at where all of the human rights abuses are happening, they're all concentrated in Houthi territory.
Really?
Because the rebels steal food, mismanage water infrastructure, and commit human rights abuses such as genocide. Comparatively, when our forces capture cities, we quickly restore stability and increase resources, restoring prosperity. However, the only way we can continue chugging along with this war is with American support in order to gain critical victories in places like the port of Hodeidah.
Your Highness, what is the Saudi endgame in the Yemen conflict?
The complete and total destruction of the Yemeni resistance movement and the re-establishment of the previous Yemeni government. There is no other alternative for the Saudi coalition.
Is the conflict in Yemen Saudi Arabia's fault?
No, not at all. The conflict would end in a single day if Iran just stopped funding the Yemenis. This is all of Iran's fault. Saudi Arabia is only acting in self-defense. Tell me, how can we let a terroristic Iranian puppet state exist on our border, giving Iran the perfect opportunity to expand their influence and attack us? This is part of their broader strategy to surround us, and we just cannot let that happen.
Why can't Saudi Arabia just compromise?
Our first priority is victory, and our second priority is the Yemeni civilians. But we have changed strategies and have taken advantage of American arms like smart bombs and American intel to target precise locations and minimize civilian casualties. We do not want this war to be painful. There's just no other option but for it to be painful.
Your Highness, it was an honor to meet with you.
After a stunning interview with the Crown Prince, I flew to Washington, D.C. in order to log my interview with the Crown Prince for security reasons. I needed answers. How could such a polarizing conflict come to an end? How could peace possibly be resolved after years of bloodshed? After I decided to get the perspective of an American analyst. Dr. Simon works for the Brookings Institute and specializes in America's impact on Middle Eastern conflicts. He took the time out of his busy schedule to meet with me today.
All right, well, Mr. Simon, I appreciate you taking the time to come sit with me here today and discuss Middle Eastern foreign policy for the United States. My first question to you would have to be, is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia using U.S. weapons to attack Houthi targets in Yemen?
Well, clearly yes. Saudi Arabia relies heavily on the U.S. to supply them with weapons to wage war against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. The Saudi-led coalition carries out air bombings in northern Yemen primarily with the F-15 aircrafts that the U.S. supplies them with. We also provide them with American Abraham tanks and artillery. The Saudis also use their navy, which consists of American warships, in order to block any humanitarian aid from reaching Yemen's ports. The coalition would come to a complete standstill if the U.S.
What do you believe is the United States motive for selling more weapons to Saudi Arabia over the past couple of years?
Well, back in 2015, the Obama administration started supporting the Saudi-led coalition by providing them billions of dollars of weapons to their cause. They did so because the U.S. needed Saudi Arabia's support in order to get the Iranian nuclear deal passed, which was being negotiated at the time. The Americans thought that this would be a quick war and end in a couple of weeks, but fast forward 4 years and we're still in it and there's no end in sight. The Trump administration continues to back the Saudi kingdom as well by still providing them billions of dollars of missiles, bombing equipment, and parts for the Saudi aircrafts and other weaponry. In April, President Trump vetoed a resolution passed by Congress to end U.S. military assistance to the Saudi government. The administration argued that if America left and cut off all arms sales, Saudi Arabia would forge an alliance with Russia, which would just increase Russia's presence in the Middle East. And so the U.S. wants to maintain its presence in the Middle East and be a close ally with Saudi Arabia, which is still keeping checks on Iran. And despite the increased domestic production of oil and natural gas and less U.S. reliance on Saudi oil, Saudi Arabia still remains one of the biggest producers of exporters of oil, giving them substantial control over the global oil prices and being very powerful. The Saudis are also an important counterterrorism partner for the U.S. in a very unstable region. And so the US tries to still sell weapons to Saudi Arabia in order to appease them.
What do you believe is a viable solution to quell the violence that is occurring in Yemen?
The most obvious solution would be if the US halted all sales to Saudi Arabia, but given our vital diplomatic relations right now, this might not be ideal. But there can be a compromise. The US can leverage the weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and come to a compromise. This war started out as a few weeks of military operation, but has been stretched out to 4 years now, with no end in sight. A complete victory in Yemen, especially Houthi-led northern Yemen, now seems unattainable for the Saudi-led coalition. With Yemen on the brink of famine, which would claim many of innocent lives, the US has to help both parties reach a power-sharing agreement. Now, the Saudis rely heavily on the US weapons, their aircraft and spare parts, and even US intelligence and logistics. And so they can use this to leverage the military conditions and make Saudis reconsider this disastrous war, which would be help us get to a more political solution.
But if the US stops supplying weapons and spare parts to Saudi Arabia, how likely is it that they would seek a new alliance with the Russian Federation?
Well, I think it's highly unlikely that the Saudis would be in any hurry to end the 70-year alliance they've had with the US and just start buying Russian weapons. Over the past few decades, the Saudis have invested heavily on the US weapons, which require more ammunition and spare parts from US manufacturers. They cannot be just swapped for new Russian parts. It won't work. It's taken too many years in order to build up their army, navy, and their air force. And it would also take a lot of time to train new soldiers in the use of these new weapons given by the Russians. And now the Saudis can't just take a time out from the war because they have too much at stake. And so they need the continuous supply of US weapons.
If the Saudis do decide to part ways with America and form an alliance with Russia, what do you think it will impact, and how do you think it will impact the Middle East, specifically Yemen?
Assuming the Saudis do break their ties with the US and get Russia in the picture, it might not be the worst thing. As in Syria, Russia wants to prove to the international community that they are a great mediator. Russia also does have a history in the region. In the mid-1980s and 90s, the Soviet Union helped stop fighting and unified North and South Yemen, which were then two separate countries. So Russia feels that they would be able to leverage their partnership with Iran and force them to stop supplying weapons to the Houthi rebels, pressuring them to come to a political settlement. Russia would also then have ties to Saudi Arabia, and due to their unique strengths and close ties with both fighting sides, Russia would be the important party that would keep Yemen and Saudi Arabia from fighting and could finally instill peace.
Mr. Simon, my last question for you would have to be, how likely do you think it is that the US would stop its dealings with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia?
Well, honestly, highly unlikely. The US has had an alliance with the Saudis for almost 70 years now. There have been countless opportunities to cut off ties, but the last two administrations have completely overlooked the wrongdoings of Saudi Arabia and have continued to sell billions of dollars of weapons to the Saudis. The fact that Saudi Arabia is our counterterrorism partners in a very unstable region, they help us against Iran, manage the global oil price fluctuations, and invest heavily in the US economy, it's highly unlikely that the Trump administration would ever sever ties with Saudi Arabia.
Mr. Simon, thank you very much for your time.
No problem.
As it stands right now, there are many alternatives for the U.S. to make peace in Yemen. On April 16, 2019, President Trump vetoed a bipartisan action which would have effectively ended an American military presence in Yemen, thereby delaying a possible peace deal. Ever since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have been in a Cold War of sorts, fighting over influence in the Middle East. Yemen is no different. The U.S. could just completely stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia, and this would render the Saudis unable to continue the war. Saudi Arabia depends on the U.S.'s sales, and so this solution seems viable. Russia might take over, but with them being the mediator, it might not be the worst idea. Another solution would be if the US leveraged sales with Saudi Arabia. Because of the dependence, Saudi Arabia would be willing to compromise, and so the US could prevent more violence in the area. However, this is probably not going to happen. With the US wanting to keep their greatest ally in the Middle East, it is unlikely that they are ever going to change anything, or at least not soon. The US is well aware of all the atrocities being committed, and even after events like the Khashoggi killing, nothing has changed. If anything, the US is helping even more. Therefore, while the fighting has ensued for years, it is still not too late for the United States government to take action, make a difference, and ensure that no more lives are lost in this senseless conflict.